The year is 1898. An author named Morgan Robertson sits down at a small desk in his modest New York City apartment. He is preparing to add the finishing touches to his latest piece of work, a novel titled Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. What Morgan doesn't realise is the novel he is about to complete will accurately predict one of the most infamous disasters in history, the sinking of the Titanic. 14 years before the Titanic even sets sail and inevitably crashes into an iceberg, Morgan's story of The Wreck of the Titan has already been written. This is how Morgan Robertson predicted the Titanic disaster 14 years early. Morgan was born in 1861 in Oswego, New York. His father, Andrew Robertson, was a ship captain on the Great Lakes, and he seemed to pass his love for the ocean on to his son Morgan. Morgan spent much of his early life at sea, in merchant ships and steamships, touring the Atlantic. He learned the ways of the ocean and became all too familiar with the inner workings of ships and other large vessels, watching how they evolved and improved as the years went by. By the 1890s, Morgan was entering his 30s, and after retiring from the sea, he had turned to writing, mainly producing short stories and articles, many of which were adventure tales inspired by the sea, which he knew so well. Little is known about his personal life, his marital status or children. That aspect of his life remains a total mystery, but one thing that was not a mystery was Morgan's love for writing. By no means was he a best-selling author yet, but he had a growing reputation for detail, for accuracy, and particularly for imagining ships and voyages that felt real and immersive. Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan, was his most ambitious work to date. He had been writing professionally for roughly a decade when he sat down at that small desk in Oswego, New York, to complete The Wreck of the Titan in 1898. Like many of his other books, Morgan's idea for The Wreck of the Titan came from what he knew best, the sea. Throughout his life, he'd watched ships evolve, each one bigger, faster, and critically, more ambitious than the last. The late 1800s were an age of confidence. Mankind believed it had finally conquered nature with its technological and mechanical advancements. But Morgan had seen enough during his years at sea to know that this confidence was in many ways naive. The ocean was just as powerful a force as it is now, one not to be taken lightly. In his novel, he imagined a ship called the Titan. The ship was the largest vessel ever built, 800 feet in length, capable of reaching 25 knots, and described as unsinkable. It was said to carry as fewer lifeboats as the law required, which left just enough seats for half of the ship's passengers in the unlikely event of an emergency. It sailed through the North Atlantic in April, pushing at full speed despite warnings of ice ahead. Then, on a cold April night, the Titan struck an iceberg on its starboard side. This collision tore open the steel plates, allowing water to start gushing in. The impact was felt throughout the Titan. The lights flickered, the vessel began slowing, and panic began to spread. There wasn't enough lifeboats, and the ship was sinking rapidly. The main decks were flooded with both water and passengers desperately trying to find their way onto a lifeboat. But with the limited number of spaces available on those boats, many of those people wouldn't make it to the morning. Where this story truly becomes unsettling is when you start comparing the nuances within Morgan Robertson's story and the very real reality of the Titanic disaster. When the infamous Titanic set sail 14 years later, it too surpassed 800 feet in length, measuring in at 882 feet. It too could reach roughly 25 knots in speed. It too was declared as unsinkable. It also struck an iceberg on the starboard side of the ship in April in the North Atlantic Sea while travelling at nearly full speed. And just like the fictional version of the Titan, it carried far too few lifeboats. Comparatively, Morgan's fictional ship, the Titan, and the real ship, the Titanic, were almost identical, as were the details of the disaster that saw both vessels meet their demise. Morgan hadn't just captured the event, he had somehow mirrored it, detail for detail. What he wrote as fiction became a near-perfect reflection of reality. Leading up to the disaster, Morgan's novel was barely noticed, a book that, whilst entertaining, was generally quite forgettable. But when the Titanic went down in 1912, readers suddenly began rediscovering it. And then, at the snap of a finger, Morgan Robertson was no longer just an author. He was the man who had unknowingly foretold one of the greatest disasters in modern history. As the public desperately sought answers for the perceived impossible sinking of the Titanic, Robert quickly found himself in a media whirlwind. How did an ordinary man from New York predict such a significant event with such detail? People started believing that maybe it wasn't a prediction, maybe he knew this was going to happen. There were so many questions and so little answers. Reporters, historians, and conspiracy theorists all turned their attention to Robert's strange novel. But to understand why it caused such a stir, we have to go back to the moment the world first realised the Titanic was gone. When the Titanic went down on April of 1912, the world was stunned. The unsinkable ship had vanished beneath the Atlantic, taking more than 1,500 people with it. Families waited at ports for news that never came. Telegrams poured in, but few offered hope. Newspapers printed the same haunting word over and over: impossible. The largest ship ever built, fitted with every modern safety measure of its time, was gone. To many, it didn't make sense why the unsinkable vessel met such a fate. How could human progress, the symbol of watercraft evolution, be swallowed so easily by the sea? And so naturally, people wanted answers. Theories spread faster than facts. Some blamed human arrogance, and others put it down to Mother Nature intervening. But as the world mourned, something strange began to happen. Somewhere on dusty bookshelves and in forgotten libraries, an old novel began to resurface. Futility, the Wreck of the Titan, written by Morgan Robertson. Written 14 years before the disaster with chilling precision. As news spread of the eerie similarities between the fictional book and the real-world tragedy, people began comparing the pages, and with that, blame slowly began to shift. The details were just impossible to ignore. The ship's name, its size, speed, its location, the route, even the number of lifeboats. It was as if Morgan Robertson's imagination had sketched the future in advance. Soon, Morgan's name was everywhere. Reporters searched for him, scholars reread his work, and the public began to wonder, how could this man have known? As people desperately searched for answers, theories got wilder and wilder. Some claimed divine intervention, that Morgan had somehow been chosen to deliver a message or warning that humanity failed to hear. Others believed that he had glimpsed fragments of the future without realising it. There were even whispers of conspiracy, that shipbuilders, engineers or insiders knew this was going to happen, almost as if it was planned and that Morgan had been fed the details. But these theories were quite far-fetched, and none of them quite added up. Amongst all of the media attention and scrutiny, Morgan was finally able to have his say and provide an explanation as to how all of this came about. So, after all of the scrutiny and confusion, was Morgan able to put all of the rumours to bed and everyone's mind at ease? Well, Morgan started by categorically denying all of the crazy conspiracies and theories that were floating around. He said that his insight had a much simpler explanation: experience. Due to him being a relatively unknown author, people were generally unaware of Robert's background. Having spent the best part of 30 years voyaging the Atlantic, he became very familiar with life at sea. Throughout those years, he had seen the speed at which humans were relentlessly trying to improve and upgrade ships. And with that, he had seen the countless naive mistakes people made in a desperate attempt to be the first to make significant breakthroughs in the space. For many, being the first to make one of these breakthroughs was like a golden ticket. If their idea was to be such a success that it became industry standard, they would be seen as the leading expert in the field, which came with not only opportunities but significant financial benefits. To Morgan, the disaster was in many ways inevitable. He simply wrote what he believed would one day happen if mankind pushed too far, too fast, and it just so happened he was right. Despite Morgan's explanation, many were still not satisfied with the reasoning simply due to the accuracy in which he predicted the events. Perhaps his experience explains some of it, but to foresee the exact circumstances, the month, the location, even the manner of the sinking, that seemed a step too far for people to believe it was just a well-informed guess. Many accepted this explanation. It was logical, even believable, enough to put the mystery to rest. But others couldn't let it go. They couldn't accept that such eerie precision was a mere coincidence. To them, the question lingered, unanswered. Still, as the years went on, the noise began to fade. The headlines stopped, the intrigue dulled, and Morgan Robertson quietly returned to what he loved most, writing. Morgan continued to write after the Titanic sank, though none of his later work ever reached the same level of fame as The Wreck of the Titan. He passed quietly in 1915, alone in an Atlantic City hotel room. And just like that, the man who foresaw one of the most infamous disasters to date vanished into history, leaving behind only his words and the question that still echoes today: was it coincidence or something else entirely? To this day, no one truly agrees on how Morgan Robertson managed to write something so eerily close to reality. Even now, more than a century later, the debate continues. Was it pure coincidence, or did he simply understand ships and the people who built them so well that the story almost wrote itself? Maybe it was neither, and those who believe there was something more, something just beyond explanation, are correct. With Robertson no longer here to settle the debate, his story continues to reverberate through time, a mystery that refuses to fade. This is the story of the man who predicted the Titanic disaster 14 years before it happened.